This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. A Georgia State Appeals Court will hear former President Trump's appeal of the Fani Willis disqualification ruling. The court today said Trump can file an appeal within the next 10 days. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards has more.
I'm here with the prosecutors and investigators.
Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis is on notice that her victory in a Georgia Superior Court is not final. The Georgia Court of Appeals on Wednesday granted the Trump team's request for an appeal. The request stems from the lower court's decision to not disqualify Willis. Judge Scott McAfee said there was an appearance of impropriety, but that defense attorneys had not proven there was a conflict. The embattled district attorney was accused of creating a conflict of interest over her personal relationship with former special prosecutor Nathan Wade. Wade resigned as a result of the judge's order, but Willis was permitted to stay on the case. Trump's attorney, Stephen Sadow, applauded the appeals court decision, saying the former president looks forward to arguing before the appeals court. Sadow said the case should ultimately be dismissed. A decision by the appeals court could take months. In Florida, another Trump criminal trial is being delayed. Judge Eileen Cannon on Tuesday ordered that the trial be reset by a separate order following the resolution of the matters before the court. She wrote that there was a myriad of trial and classified document issues pending that required her to delay the trial. Senate Democrats think Cannon's handling of the case is questionable.
She's taken a course of action which was unexpected.
There are increasing, well-justified doubts about the ability and the experience that this judge should have to deal with this kind of challenging case.
The ruling comes days after special counsel Jack Smith admitted in a court filing that the order of papers in some of the boxes seized by FBI agents had been changed. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
Despite international criticism, Israel Defense Forces are continuing their ground operations in eastern Rafah and the Gaza Strip. And most recently, the United States paused a shipment of weapons to Israel due to these operations. NTD's Jason Perry has the latest on the war.
The IDF on Wednesday released video showing troops operating in eastern Rafah, marking day 2 of the Israeli ground offensive into the southern Gaza City. After taking control of the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing, the IDF reportedly conducted raids on suspicious buildings from which Hamas terrorists fired at Israeli troops. The IDF reported killing 30 terrorists during the operation and destroyed large amounts of terrorist infrastructure in the region. And Israeli fighter aircraft struck about 100 targets from the air. And on the Israeli side of the border, tanks were seen firing towards Rafah. Meanwhile, in the United States on Wednesday, in a congressional hearing, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was asked about Israel's operation in Rafah, and he was interrupted by protesters yelling, "Free Palestine!"
Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions.
Austin confirmed that the U.S. had paused the shipment of weapons to Israel due to the Rafah operation. Senator Lindsey Graham shared his concerns about the decision.
And you're telling me you're going to tell them how to fight the war and what they can and can't use when everybody around them wants to kill all the Jews? And you're telling me that if we withhold weapons in this fight, the existential fight for the life of the Jewish state, it won't send the wrong signal?
Israel's military spokesperson also appeared to respond to the move.
The aid is unprecedented. The operational partnership is significant. When there are disputes, and there are, they are being resolved behind closed doors in a matter-of-fact way. We are responsible for the security interests of the State of Israel, and we are attentive to the interest of the United States in the region.
The Pentagon on Tuesday said the U.S. military completed construction of the offshore pier that will later be brought to the Gaza shore to help deliver aid to the region. And on Wednesday in Cyprus, workers loaded humanitarian aid onto a ship for what is expected to be the first cargo to be delivered to the Gaza Strip using the pier. It was unclear when the ship would depart. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Meanwhile, in Jerusalem today, CIA Director William Burns met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two reportedly spoke about the push for a potential hostage release and ceasefire deal. This meeting comes after Hamas negotiators held talks with Israel on a possible truce in Gaza. Burns also met privately with Mossad Director David Barnea and other Israeli officials. This is Burns' second trip to Israel in less than a week. A hearing on anti-Semitism in America's K-12 public schools. The House Committee on Education and the Workforce today discussed combating hateful speech and actions against Jewish students and faculty. The hearing included school officials from New York, California, and Maryland, and comes in the wake of anti-Israel protests that swept across American colleges. NTD's Fiona G has more.
The Holocaust ended in 1945. The hate behind it has not. Anti-Semitism is repugnant in all its forms, but the topic of today's hearing is particularly troubling. It's hard to grasp how anti-Semitism has become such a dominant force in our K-12 schools. Some kids as young as second grade are spewing Nazi propaganda, which begs the question, who has positioned these young minds to attack the Jewish people? The very need for this hearing is a travesty. The aftermath of October 7th has revealed some of the ugliest, most deprived ideas, once marginalized from polite society, and our education system has failed to stop it. It's not just anti-Israel, it's anti-American, it's anti-democracy.
House Republicans questioned school administrators' lack of disciplinary action in addressing discriminatory rhetoric. Concerns were also raised about hateful videos that propagated anti-Semitism on popular social media platforms such as TikTok. Discussions revolved around incidents of anti-Semitism in K-12 schools, including a riot against a Jewish high school teacher in Queens, New York.
Is the former principal at Hillcrest still drawing a salary from New York City Public Schools today?
Yes, he is.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said, yes, he is.
You are still paying
he is no longer the former principal of the school.
How can Jewish students feel safe at New York City Public Schools when you can't even manage to terminate the principal of Open Season on Jews High School, or even endorse suspension of student harassment? How can Jewish students go to school knowing that he is still on your payroll, sir?
I know whose payroll it is, sir. And it's not Open Season on Jews School. It's called Hillcrest High School. That's the name of the school. And at that school, we considered his leadership not strong enough to be the leader in that school.
Wow, but he can still strong enough to participate in your school district? He's still strong enough to be on your payroll?
As the leader of that school.
Proposed strategies at the hearing to combat anti-Semitism include modifying curricula to include a more comprehensive view of Jewish history and increased media literacy training to teach students to think critically about the content they consume on social media. Fiona G., NTD News.
D.C. police dismantled an encampment of pro-Palestinian protesters at George Washington University this morning, just hours before the city's mayor and chief of police were slated to testify before the House Oversight Committee. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez delves deeper.
At approximately 3:30 in the morning, Metropolitan Police of D.C. cleared an illegal encampment of pro-Palestinian protesters that had been occupying parts of the George Washington University campus since April 25th. According to Metropolitan Police Chief Pamela Smith, it was elements that they detected since last Thursday that prompted authorities to take action.
But over the past few days, we began to see an escalation in the volatility of the protests at GW. This started last Thursday when a GW campus police officer was pushed by protesters.
According to Metropolitan Police Chief Pamela A. Smith, it was elements detected after last Thursday that prompted authorities to take action. But it's worth noting that George Washington University president had sent last week a letter to D.C. officials requesting assistance in clearing the illegal encampment.
On Monday, MPD learned of more indicators that the protest was becoming more volatile and less stable. This included a simple assault reported to GW police, security probing of a GW building, indicators that counter-demonstrators were covertly in the encampment, and information that protesters from other schools were traveling to GW.
33 people were arrested, 29 for trespassing and 4 for assaulting police officers. When pressed whether the scheduled deposition before Congress played any part in the decision-making of D.C. authorities, this is what they had to say.
It did not. All of the decisions that I've made is based on public safety. I had the opportunity to speak with Chairman Comer this morning, and he expressed his interest in making sure the city and the chief could focus on this ongoing operation.
In a statement Wednesday morning, Chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Congressman James Comer, said he was pleased that the actions of the committee had forced D.C. officials to take action. Congressman Comer also confirmed that the scheduled hearing to depose D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and Metropolitan Police Chief Pamela A. Smith had been canceled. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Staying on the arrests at George Washington University, what do students and eyewitnesses think about the events that have unfolded there over the last 2 weeks? NTD's Sam Wong spoke with some folks walking by to find out.
We're here on the campus of George Washington University, and this is about as close as we can get to where the encampments and arrests took place. So right now, as you can see behind the barricades, police remain very much on duty. So just to bring you back to what happened overnight, police began clearing out the encampments at around 3:30 a.m. this morning, and they have so far arrested 33 demonstrators. Now I spoke to some students at the universities to find out what they think about the unrest that took place in the last 2 weeks. What do you think about the arrest that took place overnight? Do you think it's long overdue, or do you think it should have never happened?
I don't think it necessarily should have never happened. I'd say the level of violence definitely wasn't at a point where arrests were necessary.
I'm for it. Arrest them.
I think prior to this happening, it was very peaceful. It was totally fine within their First Amendment right. But then if it escalated, then I agree that there should be some sort of de-escalation going on.
Cops basically invaded the encampment in the middle of the night while everybody was sleeping. I feel as though that's kind of universally seen as a very cowardly move.
I'm sad that it happened. People shouldn't get hurt, but I see both sides.
Just to think back for a little bit, do you think it was mostly peaceful? Do you think there were certainly moments where it could have escalated to something that's a lot worse?
It was mostly peaceful. I remember one time they put the barricades up and made a little shrine. It was kind of dope.
They're vandalizing the property. They're not changing anything, and I think that if they have something to contribute, they should go get a job and then donate the money to their cause that they're fighting for.
When they had the statue of George Washington and they put the Palestinian flag over his face, that was like a bugaboo for a lot of old people like me.
Breaking news from Capitol Hill. The House has just blocked Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's attempt to oust Speaker Mike Johnson. The vast majority of Republicans, joined by Democrats, moved to table the motion by a vote of 359 to 43. Greene, along with the motion's co-sponsor Thomas Massie, said Johnson hasn't lived up to his promises as House Speaker. The issue started when he allowed a vote on a foreign aid package that brought tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. House Democrats and Johnson's GOP allies had previously vowed to dismiss the motion to vacate. Investigating the cost of the border crisis, the House Budget Committee today examining the financial burden on the U.S. caused by illegal immigration. NTD's Virginia Gibson has that story and how China might be involved.
House Budget Committee Chairman Jody Arrington on Wednesday said reports show that the border crisis costs the U.S. anywhere between $150 and $400 billion annually.
The lion's share of that cost is borne by state and local governments. And friends, state and local governments can't borrow or print money like the federal government. And so they're having to balance their budgets by either absorbing this cost through raising taxes, or they're having to cut services to their citizens.
He added that costs come to about $9,000 per illegal immigrant. Arrington says that's more than the U.S. spends on Medicaid beneficiaries. It's also more than veterans receive in way of retirement benefits. An Army veteran and former Border Patrol agent says American adversaries might be behind these huge costs.
Weaponized mass migration has happened over 80 times since the 1951 Refugee Convention. It's when a state or a non-state actor uses human beings as a weapon to eradicate someone's sovereignty.
If it's organized, somebody's doing the math on how much money we're pouring into this.
The Chinese use the unrestricted warfare, so it's every asymmetric means to eradicate our sovereignty and security. And financial warfare is one of those means.
Democrats, meanwhile, criticized the fact that Republicans were holding Wednesday's hearing, saying they should pass a border bill instead, which came out of the Senate.
So to quickly recap, step one, Republicans demanded a border deal. Step two, they negotiated a border deal. Step three, when Trump ordered them to, they killed that border deal. And finally, step four, here we are holding a hearing about how bad the border is.
The House isn't picking the Senate bill up because Republicans say it would only allocate money to the border without fixing underlying issues.
I deal with Republicans and Democrats on the border. The only Democrats I've heard from that support that are here in Washington, D.C. The Democrats on the border don't support the Senate bill, but the ones here do.
Before that Senate bill came to be, the House had already passed a border bill titled H.R. 2, but the Senate is not picking that one up. Virginia Gibson, NTD News.
Campaigning in a key battleground state, President Biden jabs former President Trump over what Biden calls a fizzled economic promise. It comes as new polling shows Americans trust Trump over Biden on the economy. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more on Biden's speech in Wisconsin.
President Biden is in Wisconsin on Wednesday touting an about $3 billion investment by Microsoft to build a new AI center in Racine. But here's the twist. Biden chose the exact same site where former President Trump, as president years ago, and touted a massive project by Taiwanese manufacturer Foxconn that ultimately failed to generate the thousands of jobs that had promised. President Biden today using that to attack Trump, accusing him of failing to deliver on his economic promises. Watch.
Foxconn turned out to be just that, a con. They dug a hole with those golden shovels, and then they fell into it. We make promises and we keep promises.
The White House says Microsoft AI project touted by Biden will create thousands of jobs in the battleground state, and it's all part of Biden's so-called Investing in America agenda, which he says is to boost domestic manufacturing and to grow the economy.
We're seeing a great American comeback story all across Wisconsin, and quite frankly, the entire country. The bottom line is we're doing what's always worked in this country, giving people a fair shot.
A new Quinnipiac University poll released on Wednesday shows Biden leading Trump by 6 percentage points in Wisconsin. But another poll released by ABC this week shows that more Americans trust former President Trump than they do President Biden on the economy. And as Biden's campaigning in these battleground states, Trump has been decrying election interference as he's mostly stuck at a New York courthouse for most of these days. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
The Biden administration is hosting the Chinese regime's climate envoy in Washington, D.C. this week. This comes after the two countries signed the Sunnyland Statement, agreeing to cooperate on climate objectives, such as transitioning away from fossil fuels. John Podesta, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, is meeting with his Chinese counterpart in person for the first time. The State Department says the meeting will focus on energy transition, greenhouse gases, and more. Despite being the world's biggest polluter and lacking in environmental regulations, China is not held in the Paris Agreement to the same climate goals as developed nations, such as the U.S. Critics say the Chinese regime is using the climate discussion to couple itself with the U.S. and its economy at a time when the U.S. is reevaluating its relations with China. Earlier, I spoke to Andrew Harding, research assistant at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, about the climate talks. Andrew Harding, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Tiffany.
Now, the U.S. and China are holding climate talks in Washington this week. Now, you just co-authored a report that just came out with Heritage. Now, how is China not just benefiting, but also hurting American energy security?
China is ultimately hurting American energy security because every time we try to work with China on these agreements, it's only pushing us further into dependency on Chinese manufacturing and supposed trust on getting their climate arrangements in check. The problem is that the Biden administration, under its current proposals, are only further pushing us onto reliance of Chinese solar panels, wind turbines, and other technologies that'll make American consumers more reliant on Chinese energy and less dependent on the energy we have here at home. As a result, the more that we see these agreements continue to be discussed or have various meetings occur, these meetings are just that. They're not producing substance that are helping the American people. And unfortunately, China's been working at this for decades, not only under Xi Jinping, to where the American people are having to suffer under China's advancements and this administration's inability to put America first when it comes to our energy policies.
Expanding on that, we are seeing the U.S., especially now, focus on the so-called renewable or green energies, especially electric vehicles or EVs. Now, we're seeing China dominating in that field, right? Whether that's the materials or even the EVs themselves. What is the impact on the American people?
The impact of the American people is that the further we go down this climate agenda, the higher prices will be and the fewer options that'll be available to the American people. Unfortunately, China is able to get massive advantages with these green technologies that rather than using the great things that America has here at home, we're going to be seeing these various solar panel technologies, wind turbines that are pushed more towards the American people that we simply just don't want. The markets don't want. It's very much a government-pushed agenda that the American people haven't signed up for. As a result, that means the American people won't be able to take advantage of the natural gas that we have here in America that China doesn't have access to. It's pretty unique, is something we found in our report, that the United States is one of the top 3 energy exporters, while China remains one of the world's largest importers for energy. Yet we here have an energy problem, and that shouldn't be the case. Therefore, we should rather change course and put a larger emphasis on American independence and dominance to make sure American consumers don't have to feel the impacts of government mandates and rules pushed down their throats. We want to make sure that American people have the options and choices available that suits their needs, that can make sure their families are able to prosper, and make sure we're not over-dependent on Chinese energy or equipment to get American interests secured.
On that note, given this report that you co-authored, Chinese Handcuffs, How China Exploits America's Climate Agenda, what was the most surprising aspect you discovered while researching?
The most surprising aspect is that this has been a decades-long strategy by the Chinese Communist Party to take advantage of the American left's desire to have climate agreements around the world for China's own interests. This didn't just start under Xi Jinping, where, of course, there's been a lot of advancement, and under Xi's regime, there's been a huge emphasis on green renewable technologies. But this dates back all the way to Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, and other Chinese leaders that have been able to take advantage of American politicians that want to set forth on international agreements, have international standards for reducing emissions, while giving countries such as China the cover to keep expanding emissions at the cost of countries like America reducing emissions. For example, China is very happy to hide behind a developing status term that allows them to continue producing coal power plants on a weekly basis. And since 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement, China has actually increased its emissions by 8%, while from 2000 to 2022, U.S. emissions were down by 25%. As a result, the more that we're willing to work with China on these agreements, we just continuously play into the CCP's game. And in fact, we're just being willfully blind about the ability for China to take advantage of us.
And given all of this that you just laid out, what must the U.S. do now to remove these Chinese handcuffs in terms of our energy security?
Well, it's important that we put Pittsburgh first and not Paris first. What that means is making sure American energy independence and dominance is prioritized. That means not having these moving back rules or making sure we don't move forward with mandates that require electric vehicle purchases by American people, that are able to phase out cars and various technologies that have been really important for the development of the American life and American prosperity across the country. That means getting rid of agreements that hamper American dominance, such as the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as other agreements that the Biden administration may be talking about right now with the Chinese. It also means that when we work with China, it's important to understand that when they come to the table, it's not for the global good. It's not for America's interest, it's for China's interests. Therefore, we have to be very skeptical of Chinese promises and their willingness to negotiate on climate agreements when their own information, as the data as we found in this report shows, that they continuously don't follow the rules and they're willing to bypass agreements that America will attempt to follow. As a result, America has to put the American people first, and that means having the excellent proposals that allow energy expansion and the dominance that China won't be able to match.
Andrew Harding, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Storms continue to batter the Midwest. A barrage of storms swept through the Midwest yesterday and today, unleashing heavy rain, strong gusts of wind, and tornadoes. Around 130,000 homes and businesses in North Carolina are without power this evening as storms sweep through, and around 20,000 in Michigan. In southern Indiana, the National Weather Service confirmed a tornado touchdown earlier today. Survey teams are determining if tornadoes struck locations in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia as well. The Midwest and the South are expected to get the brunt of the bad weather through the rest of the week. Major cities in its path include Indianapolis, Memphis, Nashville, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, where in total more than 21 million people live. Joining me now to discuss the pause in the arms shipment to Israel is David Wormser, Middle East Affairs Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. David, thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you again. To begin, the U.S. has paused a shipment of bombs to Israel over concerns that be used in a ground operation in Rafah that could hit civilians. How do you read this move coming from the U.S.?
Well, it's obviously an attempt to pressure Israel not to go into Rafah, or Rafah as the Arabs would call it. And it probably won't work because the Israelis see the absolute bottom line of their whole war, which comes after October 7th and the big invasion by Hamas and the killing of 1,500 civilians. They see the remaining stronghold of Hamas as something they have to remove to prevent another October 7th from happening. So they're not going to stop. And they're going to, and the pressure that the United States is trying to put on them not to go into Rafah is probably going to backfire, even with the threat of withholding weapons deliveries. In fact, it's not a threat. 2 months ago, some weapons began to be held up, and over the last week or two, weapons, 2,000-pound bomb guidance kits were already denied. So the embargo is already underway.
Now, according to reports, Israel is telling the U.S. the pause in arms could jeopardize hostage talks, adding the U.S. should pressure Hamas, not Israel. Now, NTD can't independently verify those reports, but we do know the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is tense at the moment. What is your view on all of this?
Well, you raised a good point. Hamas wants to survive. It wants to retain the third of Gaza that still is under its possession so that it can rebuild, reconstitute, and do this again. And it sees the split between the United States and Israel as something that could lead to the Israelis pausing or stopping altogether, which allows them to survive. So at the moment, the only other option they have is giving up the hostages that they hold. So they've been negotiating, not in great faith, but they've been negotiating the hostage release in order to stop the Israelis from going in. As the clock's running out on that, the United States splitting with Israel actually encourages them not to give in on the hostage issue because they have another path to survival, American pressure. So it does distance a hostage deal on some level. But I think it's a misread by both Hamas and ultimately by Washington as to how much of a choice this really is for the Israeli government. They've convinced themselves this is Prime Minister Netanyahu's war, and that it's hardliners and Netanyahu's government pushing them. But the truth is 70 to 80% of Israelis don't see victory without taking the entire Gaza Strip, and they don't see any goal for the war that's legitimate that supersedes this victory. So frankly, 70 to 80% of Israelis are behind this, including the opposition has already said that it also believes that Rafah needs to be taken. So I think the leverage isn't what Washington thinks it is, unfortunately.
Now, in terms of the U.S.'s pause in weapons, do you think the upcoming U.S. presidential election played into that decision?
Yes, I think President Biden clearly is worried about Michigan and some of the progressive votes in Michigan. The progressives have said that they can vote for a third-party candidate or not vote, and it causes great concern for Biden. But I think it's actually politically overplayed. I think it's a lot of young party operatives who are more ideological than wise, because he's about to lose the Jewish vote. All the polls show that for the first time in history, the Jewish vote may turn against the Democrats. And the Jewish vote also accounts for a huge amount of the donor base on the national level of the Democratic Party. So this, again, is likely to backfire. But I think the party structures are controlled by some fairly ideological progressives who are allowing their ideological aims to cloud their political judgment.
Now, all of this does come as CIA Director Bill Burns met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to try and help secure a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Where do you see ceasefire and hostage deals going?
Well, I think that Hamas sees the war having made, and Hamas really works with Iran. So you have to look at what Iran wants. And Iran loves to see this split between Israel and the United States. It knows that it compromises Israel's ability to take on Hezbollah in the north. So they're going to keep pushing Hamas to keep pushing. So I think that essentially this has killed the ceasefire talks.
David Wormser, Middle East Affairs Analyst at the Center for Security Policy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A busy day on Capitol Hill with another hearing today analyzing allegations of bias in NPR's reporting. Republican members say the company has a liberal slant and should not be receiving taxpayer funding. Democrats say NPR plays an important role and calls the hearing a waste of time. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
A House committee on Wednesday heard arguments over whether the partially federally funded National Public Radio, or NPR, is biased in its coverage. Members of Congress discussed halting these taxpayer funds to NPR.
But if NPR is going to be biased news, well, that's a real problem, and their new CEO is clearly not helping that case, given her extreme bias and her extreme commentary.
But if the U.S. taxpayer dollars are going to fund a radio station, it needs to be unbiased, and it's not now. It's totally liberal.
The hearing was held by the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. NPR CEO Catherine Marr was invited to the hearing but did not attend due to a scheduling conflict. This comes after a longtime and former editor with NPR, Yuri Berliner, published an article last month in the Free Press accusing his former employer of having a, quote, absence of viewpoint diversity. Some members of Congress accused NPR of representing the point of view of a small segment of the population. They cited examples of alleged bias in its recent reporting, like ignoring the Hunter Biden laptop story and dismissing the COVID lab leak theory early on. Many other members of Congress were against holding the hearing, asserting the importance of NPR and accusing the Republican members of wasting time.
Disagreeing with reporting does not mean the information is biased.
There's so many other things that we could be focused on today that could improve the lives of the American people, and this is not one of them.
In 2023, NPR received about $7 million from the federal government. This makes up about 1% of NPR's budget. But it receives millions more from the federal government indirectly through its member dues from local stations, which also receive federal funding. How Congress will act and whether they'll actually go through with a partial defunding of the federal funds to NPR is still unclear, but the pressure is mounting as this has already come up in committee. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Republicans in Congress are introducing a bill that would make it illegal for non-U.S. citizens to vote in federal elections. Here's House Speaker Mike Johnson talking about the bill in front of the Capitol earlier today.
There is currently an unprecedented and a clear and present danger to the integrity of our election system, and that is the threat of non-citizens and illegal aliens voting in our elections. In the last 5.5 months or so, I've been to over 101 cities doing events all around the country in more than half the states. The first or second question that I am asked in every public forum is about election security.
Called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, or SAVE Act, the bill would require proof of American citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Texas Congressman Chip Roy, who introduced the bill, says there needs to be a system to guarantee that only U.S. citizens are voting. Speaker Johnson says while it's currently illegal for non-citizens to vote, there are many causes for concern. Number one is that there is no mechanism to check that those registering or voting are actually citizens, and that millions of illegal immigrants have entered the U.S. during the Biden administration. He also stated that a growing number of localities are allowing non-citizens to vote in municipal elections. And lastly is that Democrats have expressed a desire to turn non-citizens into voters. 3 men who say they were victims of sexual assault at Illinois juvenile detention centers have stepped forward with their stories. They're among 95 men and women who are suing the state. NTD's Jason Blair has more.
The lawsuit was filed on Monday and alleges widespread abuse of children at Illinois youth detention centers that spanned over decades.
The sexual abuse in Illinois youth centers has been going on for far too long.
Locke said at a press conference on Tuesday that the cases in the lawsuit span 21 years from 1996 to 2017. Co-attorney in the lawsuit, Todd Matthews, said the acts were carried out by guards, administrators, staff, and other employees of the state of Illinois.
The incidents involved all types of horrific sexual abuse.
I wish I could have used my time in the system to grow and change and become a better man through the discipline and support of the staff around me. Instead, I was sexually abused and neglected.
Many of the plaintiffs say they were threatened or rewarded to keep quiet. 10 of the 95 men and women who filed the lawsuit appeared at the news conference.
I want the world to know what happened to me and the rest of the survivors that's with me standing today.
One plaintiff said his experience led to decades of mental anguish and confusion.
Upon my arrival, I met a predator, a chaplain employed in the youth center who said I could trust him. I was victimized and sexually abused.
I was preyed upon by a dangerous man who held a position of power over me during my time at IYC Harrisburg.
The lawsuit alleges Illinois failed to supervise, discipline, remove, or investigate alleged abusers and enabled the abuse to continue. The lawsuit follows similar complaints at youth detention centers in New Jersey, California, Maryland, and others. Spokespeople for Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and the 2 corrections agencies named in the lawsuit have said that the alleged incidents took place under former administrations and that any allegations of staff misconduct are thoroughly investigated. The lawsuit seeks $2 million per plaintiff. Jason Blair, NTD News.
Unusual footage of an airplane landing. A Boeing FedEx cargo plane landed at Istanbul airport by skidding on its nose. The plane was unable to deploy the landing gear that controls the front wheel. The nearly 10-year-old Boeing 767 aircraft was flying from Paris. The traffic control tower at Istanbul airport guided it to land safely. The pilots held the plane's nose above the runway for several seconds after the main wheels had touched down. According to the Skybrary Aviation database, it's an emergency landing maneuver that pilots train for. Airport rescue and firefighting teams prepare the runway for the landing and douse the plane with firefighting foam. And now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on today, but let's start in women's basketball, where the WNBA announced that the league will use private jets going forward. When did this suddenly become an issue?
Really, I think it was just last week when Caitlin Clark arrived at the Dallas airport for a WNBA preseason game. She was essentially mobbed with people around her taking pictures, so that really brought this issue to the forefront. I think it's really a security issue, I would say. Now, of course, private jets are expensive. I mean, the league commissioner, Kathy Engelbert, said the league is going to commit $50 million, I think, over the next 2 years for this. Now, that's significant. I mean, reportedly, the league only generates about $60 million in revenue, but I think she senses that's about to go up with the interest that Caitlin Clark has already brought. Now, the league was already doing this for playoff games and for when teams would play games on back-to-back days. So this is really just a step up from that.
Moving to NHL news, last night we had 2 games decided in overtime. Tonight we have 2 more, including Game 1 of Vancouver versus Edmonton. What is the status of Canucks goalie Thatcher Demko?
Yeah, he's listed as out for tonight's game with an unspecified injury. It's possible that he could return this series, though. Now, not only is Demko their top goalie, he's a finalist for the Vezina Trophy, which is given to the league's top goalie. So it's a big loss. Now, he's already been out for 2 weeks, and Vancouver is advanced anyway, though. It hasn't been announced who will start in Demko's place, but whoever it is will have their hands full with Edmonton. I mean, they scored the 4th most goals during the regular season, and they boast 3-time MVP Connor McDavid. Now, in the other game tonight, it's Game 2 between Florida and Boston. The Bruins took Game 1 5-1. They've really been led this postseason by goalie Jeremy Swayman, who has a playoff high 210 saves.
Shifting gears now to the NBA, former Indiana Pacer Reggie Miller made waves this week when he joked that the boogeyman is coming back to town. What was he referring to here?
His storied rivalry with the New York Knicks, especially at Madison Square Garden, where he's torched them a couple of times. Now, yesterday was actually the 29th anniversary of his 8 points in the final 18 seconds to stun the Knicks. It was quite a sequence, too. I mean, the Knicks were up 6 with 18 seconds left, Game 1 of their series. It really looked like a mundane win, and then boom, he hits a three-pointer, immediately steals the inbounds pass, takes one step back, and drains another three. All in a matter of about 4 seconds, and now the game is suddenly tied. Now, I'll grant there was some contact when they stole the ball. The guy who was guarding fell down. No foul was called. In any case, just seconds later, he draws a foul, hits both free throws to win the game, all in front of a stunned MSG crowd. Now, this was a year after his incredible 25-point fourth quarter where he hit an NBA record 5 playoff threes to lead the Pacers to a comeback win, again at Madison Square Garden against the Knicks. All while jawing with Knicks superfan and director Spike Lee, who drew really the ire of most other Knicks fans because they thought maybe he said something that got Miller going. Whatever the case, the Knicks did recover to win that series. But the Knicks and Pacers are finally playing in the playoffs again, and Miller is now an analyst for TNT, so he's at these games.
Tonight we have Game 2 of that series played at Madison Square Garden. Now, a lot has been made of Brunson's hot streak, but what does Indiana need to do to win?
Well, for one, they need to get Tyrese Halliburton healthy. He was questionable for Game 1 back spasms. He's still questionable tonight. He did play Game 1, but he scored 6 points. That's well under his season average of 20 points per game. But back to Brunson, he's had 4 straight 40-point playoff games now. That really joins some select company. I mean, that ties Michael Jordan and Bernard King for the second longest playoff streak of all time. Jerry West actually had 6 straight. Now, all 3 of those guys that I just mentioned, they are Hall of Famers. But Brunson has really been taking over at the end of games. He did this to Philadelphia in the last round. He did it in Game 1 against the Pacers, scoring 21 in the fourth to lead the Knicks from a 9-point deficit to a victory. Now, the Sixers never really had an answer. I don't know what the Pacers can do. I mean, some guys are just better in the playoffs.
Well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.